Should we get going?
I would.
All right. Crystal.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to MECLP's Fall Webinar Series, Becoming a Leader in Early Childhood Education at the Time of Equity. Our session today is From Idea to Realization, the story of how the Children's Equity Project was built. My name is Crystal Harris, and I am the Judy Center Coordinator at Dorothy I. I will be one moderator for this webinar. And Rashawn Casey is the other moderator for our webinar today, who is the Director of Early Childhood Programs at the Archdiocese of Washington Catholic Schools Office, supporting their preschools and childcare programs, and a current MECU Fellow. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Rashawn.
Thanks, Crystal. Hi, again, I'm Rashawn, and nice to meet and see everyone here today. We're going to ask that if you could, in the chat, list your name and the organization that you are representing here today. Just put that information in the chat for us. And we're going to get started, and I'm going to introduce our presenter and our speaker for today, and that is Shantel Meek, who was a professor of practice at Arizona State University and the founding director of Children's Equity Project, which is housed at Arizona State University. Shantel, I'm going to get started with the first question, and it is just to kind of highlight, you have an outstanding career at a very relatively young age, being a part of the Obama administration during his term. Can you tell us how you landed on that leadership position and what kind of support you had along your leadership pathway?
Sure. Hi, Rashawn, and hi, everybody. Pleased to be here with you today and share a little bit of time together. Yeah, so it was a mix of luck and wonderful mentors and opportunities and a lot of work. I would say back in 2008, I was in graduate school, getting my PhD in child development, and Barack Obama started his election right around that time, 2007. And like many people across the country, I was very inspired by him and his ideas and the alignment and his vision. So I volunteered on the campaign for some time. And then, you know, I was in the middle of graduate school, so I was taking courses and doing research, and he won the presidency, and I continued throughout grad school. And in 2011, I applied for an internship at the White House. Cold applied. I didn't know anybody in DC. I didn't know anything about policy, really. I knew about child development, but I didn't really know about policy. And so I wanted to, you know, test the waters. I was interested in policy. And so I applied and I got in. So I moved to DC for an internship in the Obama White House. And I loved it. I loved the policy world. I loved learning about it. I loved all of the context and the action of being in DC and being able to influence things at a national level. So I was hooked from then, but I went back home and I finished all of my coursework and my comprehensive exams, and then the administration called and said that they had a position, a permanent, not permanent, but a political appointment in early childhood development at the Department of Health and Human Services that they'd like for me to interview for. So I flew to DC, I interviewed, I got that position, and I started as a special assistant and worked my way from that to a policy advisor, and then from that to a senior policy advisor. And then I jumped over to working in the White House at the Domestic Policy Council, working on the early education portfolio as part of the broader education team. And I ended up staying until the very last day when Mr. and Mrs. Obama flew off on Air Force One that late morning. So yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, it was a combination of kind of luck that I even knew there was a White House internship. I didn't know. The way I found out was my very first trip to DC was in 2011 or in 2010. And I made a White House tour, like the way people do them, right? Like through your congressperson, you just email them. And I was in line for my White House tour, and I happened to be in line behind White House interns. And that is how I found out that the White House had an internship program. So that's when I went home and applied, but that was luck, fate, I don't know, whatever you call it. And then from then on, it was, you know, I worked really hard, but there were also just people who believed in me and who helped me and who opened doors for me along the way, throughout that pathway. And it started with my mentors at the White House from the internship, to my mentors in HHS, which was, you know, Linda Smith was, you know, my biggest mentor who I worked with very closely, to my mentors later when I moved to the White House. And, you know, I think that was a pattern kind of along the way. So I'll stop there.
Okay, that is an awesome way. Shantel, can you tell us, when you worked in the policy arena, what made you focus on equity or inequity for young children? How did it affect you?
I think I've always been interested in justice, right? And advancing justice and equity. I don't think I had the language for it when I first started thinking about the issue that I have now, of course, but I've just always been really interested in it. I mean, I came from a small border town on the border with Mexico in southern Arizona. I'm a first generation college graduate in my family, grew up in a bilingual household, Mexican American, and, you know, went to Title I schools my entire trajectory, and then to a state university, and just also obviously had the experiences of lots of peers and cousins and friends and others who did not have the same opportunities that I had, and did not kind of proceed on to college and you know, so on and so forth. And that was always on my mind, right? Because I wasn't any smarter than them. So, you know, I had that, I think, constantly as an anchor, and thinking of where I grew up in my hometown and my cousins and my family and my friends and everybody else, and wanting, you know, greater opportunity and acknowledging, right, the unfairness and the unequal opportunity that beyond, you know, my community. So I think that always grounded me. I've also always just been focused on fairness. And I think the more I learned about the national landscape broadly, the more I started gaining that vocabulary and understanding of, you know, all of the disparities that exist and why they exist, right? The more I got interested and started veering more and more in that direction. So I can't really explain why exactly, but it's, I think, a combination of all of those factors. I think around the time, you know, it was pretty early on in my tenure in the administration, President Obama launched My Brother's Keeper initiative in response, not really in response to this, but the murder of Trayvon Martin around the same time kind of prompted a national conversation about the supports, and, you know, we were giving to young boys and men of color. And there was just a whole lot of kind of conversation at the time about the injustices, the racism, the inequities in opportunities that existed. And so at the same time, the Department of Education published the first round of preschool discipline data that had really ever been existed at the national level. And it showed stark racial disparities similar to what we saw in K-12, but it was, people couldn't believe it because they were basically babies, right? Like kids fresh out of diapers, 3 and 4-year-olds. So that garnered a lot of attention and public will to do something about it. And so I was in the middle of a lot of that work, and started going down that path when I wrote the administration's policy statement on preschool suspension expulsion, and then continued, right, like that equity work when a year later we wrote a policy statement on inclusion of kids with disabilities and the intersections there between race and disability, and thinking through the segregation of kids with disabilities, especially preschoolers with disabilities. And then later went on to write work on a policy statement on dual language learners, right? And trying to veer us away from this English only immersion environment that we were in, and pushing toward access to bilingual education for kids who speak another language at home. So I just kind of, I guess, naturally was drawn to these areas because they were such clear injustices and inequities for the youngest children and families. And so I guess that's how, it was a matter of kind of the environment, always being kind of driven by these pieces and the opportunity to engage and the opportunity, honestly, for the administration and my immediate mentors to be like, yeah, that's really important. You should go write about that. And kind of standing behind and supporting that work to come out on behalf of the government.
That's an inspiring journey that you took from the start and then how it transitioned and it impacted and influenced your work in inequity and equity policy. So thank you for sharing that with us. It really is inspiring. As part of the MECLP program, we go through a capstone project. We do a capstone project, which is a way for us to demonstrate a solid understanding of the issues in the field of early childhood education and what we can do about it. The Children's Equity Project is sort of your own capstone project. And how did you pull that off?
I don't know. I felt like I don't have a clear playbook. It was I still some days where the CEP is now about 4.5 years old, and I still feel some days that we're still building the plane as we're flying it. But I think I had, again, great mentors that did not end when the administration ended. So I had continuing support and mentorship from people I really valued and trusted, and who are really respected in the field, right? And so I had that support system to be like, hey, I have this idea. What do you think of this idea? Is this, what would you do different? How, right, to kind of start to shape and mold the idea and have people to discuss it with. I think too, there was just a clear gap in the field, right? There are lots of national organizations, lots of think tanks, lots of, players in the field of early childhood. And many of them cared or said they cared or did some work related to equity, which was great. But none of them kind of had that exclusive focus on equity, right? They all had a focus on something else, and then they would kind of bring in equity as it pertained to that something else. And there wasn't kind of a central national organization at the policy level that was whose job it was to exclusively push equity across all of the different issues in early childhood. So I saw a clear need for that, right? And to fill that gap. And of course, the continuing need, right? As we know, racism continues, inequities continue, unequal distribution of resources in our field and beyond our field continues. And so there's a need, right, for this work to go on. And I think we certainly didn't fill the whole need. We've filled the space, but there continues, it's a huge job with much more efforts needed. But I think that's how I would sum it up, I guess. It was a need in the field, it was a gap that was there, lots of colleagues and mentors to support the development of it. I hadn't raised $1 in my life before starting the CEP. And so that was a whole new challenge and interesting space to try to form relationships with funders and how do I pitch this and how do I make the case for this? But again, I think I'd go back to just good friends and colleagues in the field to that helped me make that transition over.
Thank you for sharing that. And I was writing down your importance because you mentioned it twice about mentorship and having that support that help you do that. So that is a good reminder for us to find a good mentor that can help us. The Children's Equity Project focuses on closing opportunity gaps and dismantling systematic racism in learning settings to ensure that children reach their full potential. Can you explain what you have seen and experienced in terms of systematic racism in early education learning settings, and how does the project address it?
Yeah, so I think part of our work has been to try to operationalize equity? Like, what is it like, especially since the summer of 2020, the murder of George Floyd, right? There has like, everybody is saying equity. And often it is at a very high level, like, this is what we believe, as opposed to like, this is what we're doing, and this is how we're measuring it, and this is how we're accountable, right? And so I think from when we started, and it's part of just how my brain works, I'm a concrete thinker, and I have trouble with like abstract concepts. And so I always try to like bring it down to very specific, actionable, tangible things. And I think that's been helpful in the equity conversation, because it is often like, oh, we believe in equity, right? But not quite getting down to the action level. So I think that is a lot of what we've tried to do, is like, what is racism? How does it manifest in the classroom? What does it look like? What should we be looking for when we're trying to address that? And I think breaking it down into those like visible, measurable pieces is helpful to try to then address and remedy these areas. And to that end, I can list, I can talk about a few that are really clear, right? We've already mentioned preschool suspension, expulsion a couple of times. That is still an area of racism in urban settings, right? Data still show the same racial disparities in the children who are suspended and expelled from school, with Black children being significantly, consistently overrepresented across, right? Across ages, across settings, across states, across types of discipline, right? It is kind of the consistent finding across all of discipline, right? And so that is a really clear manifestation of racism, because at the same time, we have research that shows that Black children don't behave any worse. They don't have more frequent misbehaviors. So how do we reconcile that fact with the fact that they are much more likely to get suspended and expelled, right? And so that mismatch tells you that there is some bias in play with how we're interpreting children's behavior based on what they look like, right? So you can have, and the research has identified a number of different ways that mechanisms through which that works, right? So one of them is more scrutiny, right? So if a white child kicks their peer and a Black child kicks their peer, if you're only looking at the Black child, you're only going to see the Black child kick their peer, even though they're engaging in the same behavior as their neighbor, right? But if we're kind of hyper scrutinized on this group of children, right, especially when we're expecting challenging behavior, we're going to find more of it, right? And if you've ever known a young child, you know that all young children engage in these types of behaviors, right? All young kids like throw stuff and hit and scratch and like do all of that we consider challenge are developmentally appropriate. And so there's the scrutiny piece, right? There's like all of this body of research that finds that there is kind of, we interpret behavior different based on what children look like. And so Black children are seen as more aggressive, as more culpable, as more like fill in the blank of negative, attributes that have been found through, different varieties of research. And we find that too. And so it's not a matter, again, of like worse behavior, more frequent behavior. It's a matter of perceptions that's going on and what decisions we're making. It's also a matter of the resources that programs have available. So across the country, there is still kind of, even going to K-12, a high degree of segregation in education, right? And we know from some research that in some states, schools that are serving mostly Black and brown children have less resources. If you have less resources, right, you probably have bigger class sizes. You probably are less likely to have like a social emotional coach. You probably, like there's a number of things that resources can afford you that can make it an environment that is, more apt to support all children's social emotional development. So I think there's a number of factors at play, but that is one clear manifestation, right, of what racial inequity looks like in early learning settings. The second example, I'll just say that I'm clearly very passionate about, but also, we do a lot of work in, is the language of instruction in early learning settings, right? The fact, like, English only instruction is a manifestation of white supremacy, right? Like English is the way it has to be, right? And it is seen as superior to any other language. And, you know, I think that is a huge area. Still, the vast majority of early care and education, even programs that serve primarily Spanish speaking children or primarily children who speak another language, it's still mostly in English. Even if your teacher is bilingual, like there are all these, right, that's just the way that we do things, right? Even though we have brain science that shows that actually developing a strong first language base is really good for developing a second language later on. Even though we know that bilingualism, right, is good for executive functioning early on, it's associated with positive academics, you know, in the midterm, is associated with a whole host of long-term positive outcomes, economic, social, you know, you name it. We know all of these things, but yet when we see an English learner or a dual language learner come in the door, there's often like a negative connotation, like, oh, we gotta immerse this child in English, right? So that we can, you know, fix this child. But if we have oftentimes the pattern that we see, and that's been cropping up more and more, there has been an increase in bilingual programs across the country, but they're not targeted or reserved for English learners or dual language learners, right? And so for what you see is populations, often white, higher income populations, bilingualism is seen as like a great, like an asset, a great enrichment, like it's real fancy and good, right? And so, but then if you see an English learner, oh, it's seen as something we got to get rid of. We got to immerse them in English. And so like, there's this double, you know, it's just a different perception again. So I think that's another really clear manifestation of racism in early learning settings and kind of moving up through the system.
Shantel, some would say that the infrastructure of early education is just inherently inequitable, and would need a seismic shift to change. How do you see it?
I agree. I don't know if we're talking about infrastructure like physically, like buildings and physical infrastructure and facilities, or like infrastructure more broadly with early care and education infrastructure, but I'll address the first one first. So facilities and buildings and that type of infrastructure is massively lacking in early care and education, right? I feel like every time we hear these stories come up on the news time and time again, right? Like, oh, we found dirty water in this school or in this school district or in this community. Oh, we found like, environmental toxins here and this. But we don't require like a universal check of water in every early care and education program, or of air, or of whatever toxins, right? Head Start has very, clear regulations related to it, but there's still not like a universal, like, have we checked if all the water is clean that we're giving babies with this formula, right? Like, have we even done that universally? And it feels like every time we look, there's a problem with it, but we're not looking everywhere. So I think there's some really base fundamental challenges with facilities and kind of the health and safety of physical environments. The Inspector General at HHS and the Government Accountability Office have all like kind of looked at infrastructure in childcare and in Head Start, and they've all found super concerning findings. Again, anytime we look, there's something concerning that pops up, but yet we're not looking systematically. So I agree that it is an inequity, and there's great inequities with respect to that, and we do need massive investments to fix that. There was some funding that was spent on that with pandemic response funding. Lots of states and programs invested in some of the facilities and investments in infrastructure. But I think, we're barely scratching the surface. And like I said, what I think we need is like a universal assessment to ensure safe and healthy settings. And then we know where the problems are, and then we can invest kind of in those targeted remedies to make sure that, because that's baseline, right? Like coaching and degrees and all that other stuff comes after we make sure that the physical place where children are spending hours and hours and hours every week is safe and healthy.
Wow, that's very good points that you made about that. I'm interested in what each of us can do to address and change the systematic racism in early education. I'm the director of a Baltimore City Judy Center, which is a comprehensive partnership with public Title I schools and the surrounding early childhood education and health partners. It is all designed to overcome racism and learning gaps. What advice do you have for those working in early care and education settings to address the bias in this field?
That's a great question. You know, a lot of our work focuses on the systems in which early care and education programs operate. So a lot of federal policy, a lot of state policy, but I think there is a lot local programs can do too, even within the brokenness of the higher level, levels of the system. I think the first thing is ensuring that the data that you're collecting is disaggregated and that you're analyzing it kind of on a continuous basis, and you have your eye out for disparities. So that you can identify them when they do arise, if they arise, and always just having that eye to make sure that what we're engaging in, whether it's policies, whether it's a practice, whether it's an intervention, isn't having the unintended consequence of, making disparities or, increasing disparities. And so making sure that the data we're collecting on child outcomes, on child experiences, on teacher behaviors, on whatever we're collecting data on, that we are looking at that data, continuously to be able to identify when those things arise. I think a policy audit, right? Most programs have like a policy handbook or some kind of like book or policy written down for all of the different rules and procedures and things like that. So I think an audit of that, right? Through a racial equity lens, like, are these policies fair? Are they disproportionately hurting or helping some groups? What do we know about data and research already? Like, we already know discipline is a big problem. So like, there are some clear places to look in that policy handbook that research has already told us is likely to be inequitable, right? That we can go to kind of really recognize what the policies are in our programs. The other one's professional development, of course, right? Like, what does that look like? Are we talking about racism? Are we talking about specifically about how racism manifests and how that influences the classroom and what that looks like in behavior, right? And what that looks like, in a way that is accessible to people and to staff and to the whole team, right? So that includes onboarding. Like, what are the expectations that are communicated with onboarding, with respect to equity? That includes any trainings, right? Do you have that equity lens layered across your annual social emotional training or whatever training that you're doing? And that includes coaching, right? If we're bringing in mental health consultants, or if we're bringing in quality coaches or pyramid model coaches or whatever type of coaches are coming in for the infrastructure, instructional coaches, do those coaches, right, have the racial equity lens and understand how their work affects and can be an agent for good, right, in advancing equity? And so making sure that the coaching infrastructure that we're bringing in is also, right, it's not just the frontline teachers, not just the aides, it's the coaches and the leaders and everybody else. And then the last one I'd say is beyond the confines or the walls of the program, but it's really becoming community and state advocates for policy change, beyond the actual program. So at the state level, at the community level, at the federal level, right? You all are the ones doing the work and seeing the children and serving the families and seeing this stuff day in and day out. And so that voice is invaluable, right, to the conversation on policy. So really thinking through how to communicate that then to policymakers to make change kind of at those outer levels.
How can our audience really wants to know, how can they learn, or how can the Children's Equity Project collaborate with programs in Maryland in regards to that policy change and the advocacy that you just spoke about? How can your project collaborate with programs in Maryland, and how would that work?
Yeah, so I would say we have a partnership with Montgomery County right now with the Part C folks, the early intervention folks. really thinking through how we embed equity in the early intervention system and the personnel preparation and everything related to that. We also have partnerships with states across the country and with communities in different places across the country. And it looks different, right? We support on policy change and policy implementation to really advance equity, helping kind of states and communities work through what are the inequities in your community, right? What are the policies in your handbook? What are the policies at the state level that exist, and how can we put an equity lens on that and make some policy change? We have some really concrete tools that we use that are freely available that anybody can download from the website that we partner with states on to implement, really clear, equity policies. And so it can look a number of different ways depending on the level of engagement. We've worked very deep with some states like California, Arizona. We're working very deeply with both of those. And less deep with other states, but still kind of an engagement where we kind of talk to them. We have meetings, we'll provide presentations to their workforce and things like that. So it could look a variety of ways. And I guess the concrete way to reach us, I can provide my email address. And folks are, I'm always eager and excited to work with folks who are also excited and eager to advance equity within their programs. So.
I believe we now have time for some questions. You ready for some questions, Shantel?
Yep, sounds great.
So we do have one from the audience. The question is, what advice do you have for for ECE programs to improve access of vulnerable children, considering the lack of personnel in childcare programs?
Can you read that one more time?
Sure. Basically, they want to know, what advice do you have for programs looking or wanting to improve their access of vulnerable children? However, they are faced with the challenge of a lack of personnel, not enough staff.
Yeah, I mean, that's a national problem right now, isn't it? That was worsened by the pandemic and hasn't come back to the staffing levels before. I feel like that is a really hard question to answer at the local program level, because the truth of the matter is we need more federal funding and we need more state funding to address this, because part of the reason, as we all know, that the workforce is leaving is because there are higher paying jobs basically almost anywhere outside of childcare. Childcare providers are one of the lowest paid professions across the board. And so the compensation structure is broken and has been broken, is fundamentally broken, and needs to be fixed and needs to be addressed, right? It's really hard work. It's really tiring work. It's really taxing work. It's really rewarding work and really important work. But to do all of that and still be making, just over poverty wages, clearly that doesn't match up or line up. And so we do need a much larger investment in infusion of resources. And that is often beyond the control of the local program, right? We need public funding because families can also not afford to pay more to make that, balance out. And so I think local programs are just in a really hard position, right? In terms of wanting to serve more families, but not being able to because the financing just doesn't add up in early care and education. So I think what I would say is, one, sharpen those kind of advocacy skills that we talked about, and make that part of the job too, right? To continue advocating for greater support and funding to address this like fundamental kind of broken mismatch between what it costs to provide care and what is the money currently in the system. And the other thing I would say is, in an environment with limited resources, it becomes even more important who we're offering services to. And right, the equitable approach is to consider the highest needs, the children with the highest needs, taking into account historical marginalization and current and continuous marginalization into who we're serving and who we're offering slots to.
Okay, we have another question. Would you consider promoting other languages to be taught in all schools, K through 12, plus English as a policy?
Yes. I don't think I'd hesitate on that one. I mean, there's clear research on the benefits of bilingualism. And of course, it's community, it gets complicated in communities where there are lots of home languages. So California, for example, extremely linguistically diverse state. So, Spanish is by far the most widely spoken other language in the United States. In many communities is the only kind of other language other than English. So there's like I think a clear pathway there for that. But we also need, I think, solutions and ideas for those places that are more linguistically diverse and have additional languages, because we need the workforce, right? Who also speaks those languages. So, and of course, family choice and what families want is also another critical thing to consider in all of that.
Another question is, are you personally involved in coaching others, and how are you doing that?
Like coaching teachers? Is that the level that we mean?
I believe so.
Okay. I am not personally involved in coaching the workforce. Although my organization, the Children's Equity Project, is a part of a number of national technical assistance centers that are federally funded, whose job it is to provide resources and support and coaching. It's often not at the individual provider level, but to systems leaders, other coaches and others to advance equity. So for example, one example I'll give is the National Center for Early Childhood Development, Teaching and Learning. It's one of the Head Start funded centers. And we have a team who works as part of that technical assistance center to coach and support instructional coaches, teachers, regional leaders, grantees, grantee leaders and administrators and others on embedding equity kind of across the whole instructional teaching kind of side of the house. So we're also part of another one on mental health consultation. We're part of another TA center on early childhood, special education and early intervention. So we do work, those are kind of the primary mechanisms through which we kind of directly support the workforce and more really the folks surrounding the workforce and supporting the workforce.
Okay, we have another question. What promising practices have you seen recruiting, training, and placing bilingual teachers in the early childhood settings, early childhood education classrooms?
That's a great question. So there's not like a uniform solution that works in every community. I think it differs based on what languages we're talking about, where and what the kind of makeup of the community is. I think increased compensation for being bilingual could be one approach. I think looking at alternative certification processes is another approach that has been used in K-12, at least, to get some bilingual teachers in dual language schools that could be thought about. The CDA credential, right? There are some trainers that offer the coursework in Spanish, but not nearly enough. So there are some folks across the country who have partnered with community colleges to provide coursework in Spanish, usually Spanish, sometimes other languages, to make those pathways accessible for bilingual people to kind of go toward becoming a lead teacher. I would say that I think Latinas are the main group or the group in the early care and education workforce who is most likely to be in a teacher's aide position. And so that tells me too that of course, not all Latinos are bilingual, but some of them are, many of them are. And so we have a rich linguistic diversity probably in the teacher's aide positions. And so looking at our own workforce, right, and assessing those skills and providing pathways from becoming an assistant teacher to becoming a lead teacher is another, I think, approach that we should really look at.
What are some strategies you use to overcome challenges or barriers you faced along the way?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like I was very fortunate to have a very big and close-knit family and support system growing up, right? Like, wasn't born into like a bunch of money or anything, but we had very present, supportive parents and family and community around me that I could, you know, always kind of lean on. And honestly, that carried me and, you know, throughout. So I think that support system, I mentioned my mentors a whole bunch of times. I would, you know, point to them as well. In terms of like strategies, I think continuing to stay focused on the ultimate goal, right? And the ultimate purpose and vision for what I'm trying to do and what our shared goal is, right? Which is advancing equity and making our systems more fair to serve all kids. And so there's good days and there's bad days, and there's like the pendulum swings where one day, you know, everyone's saying equity and the next day we're like banning books. So it's easy to become discouraged, right, on some of those pieces. But, you know, having colleagues and peers who are in this same fight with me to turn to, especially during those bad days, you know, just to remind each other that the struggle is long, and, you know, it's not only forward progress, that we kind of go back and forth, I think is also invaluable.
That's awesome. So thank you so much for your time today. I don't think we have any other questions. I don't see any more in the chat. Does anyone else have a question? You can definitely put that in the chat right now. But we want to thank you, Shantel, for your time. Your story is, like I said earlier, is inspirational. Lots of key points that we can definitely use on our leadership journey and our journey as early childhood professionals. Crystal, do you have any questions or last words?
I was just going to say thank you for sharing your story with us. I think there were a lot of things that stuck out for me, that mentorship, and also us, you know, as leaders, mentoring others and bringing others along. And as you mentioned, advocacy and just doing what we can to make changes within the field.
Definitely.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It was great to spend some time together.
In the chat, you'll find Shantel's ASU email address. I think she mentioned and that you can reach out to her if you have any further questions or comments. We just thank you so much. And I believe that will be it. Thank you for your time today.
And thank you everyone for joining us today. And I hope you will join us in December for our next fall seminar. Thank you.
All right, take care, everyone. Thank you.